welcome to the Down the Donut Hole podcast. And we had such fun yesterday talking about all things Irish and folklore and that sort of thing. We thought we'd continue a little bit with folklore in general because Ireland, of course, is not the only place that has fairy tales and such mysterious stories.
I think it's really worthy. But first I have to say, Des, how was your day?
From what I remember, it was fun.
Did you party last night? Did you go out last night? I mean, we're old, so we just kind of chill out at home.
Speak for yourself.
I really wanted to go out last night, but I ended up waking up on my couch.
Alone?
Yeah.
Can we get a collective?
But I had fun, though. I mean, I wasn't in a ditch somewhere.
No, and because we had kind of an early party, it's probably best not to be out on the roads. So, and I know you're conscientious about that, so I'm sure it wasn't just a default thing that you kind of chilled out later.
I hear they frown on that nowadays.
They do, but as long as you're wearing a seatbelt. I was going to ask, did you listen to your playlist while you were on the couch?
Yeah, it's not bad, actually. I mean, these aren't my songs. I just put them together, but yeah, they're fun. They're really good. I'm excited about the April Fool's one.
Are we going to do one?
Nope, April Fool's.
No.
No, wait. No, I think so. There's a lot of songs with fool in it.
All right. Yeah, that's right. Oh. If I'm a fool for loving you, make sure that's on the list.
Who does that song?
I think Nat King Cole. It's in that era. If I'm a fool for loving you.
Okay, I'll look that up.
It's a beautiful song. We were talking about folklore yesterday. I enjoy it. I'm working on a project currently that's got my nose in a lot of old books and that sort of thing, which is part of the reason why it's very current for me. But folklore is current, and it is valid. And I think that there's so much knowledge that's transmitted in the stories. And if you go back to your childhood, and if you have a favorite story, do you? Dave, did you have any that particularly stand out?
It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of the stuff back then for kids, I think was kind of based on folklore, but maybe a rewrite or different spin on things.
How about you, Des? Any story or anything like that that you call up, that the kind of the message sunk in?
I don't know. I was just thinking about, boy, if I could go back to my childhood.
Knowing what you know now?
Well, yeah, I'd learn karate so I wouldn't get beat up all the time in school. What do you mean? What do you mean? Like,
I mean, is there a story that sometimes... here's a quick example, and you'll understand better what I mean. A friend of mine, someone close to me, was in childbirth, and it was going horribly slowly. Everything was kind of not acceptable. And her husband at the time said to her, he was reciting the story of the little engine that could. So each of the labor pains, they would come and go, and he'd be saying that, And for some reason, it tapped into the sensibilities, that core sensibility. And it made all the difference. It made all the difference for my friend. And her husband, too. He was very much a part of that process. And it was a little story, but the symbolism of the story reached the core of the person. And I think there's so much of that. I mean, in our culture, when you talk about the Goldilocks zone, it's perfect.
what's that mean?
Have you ever heard it? It's kind of a recent thing.
I've heard the story of the three bears. I mean, yeah.
But so she tested the big chair, the middle-sized chair, and the little chair was perfect for her. She tested the porridge; it was too hot. The mama's porridge was too cold, and then the little baby bear's porridge was perfect for her. So it's the idea, anything that's the Goldilocks zone or a Goldilocks condition is perfect. It fits, it works.
It really is a scientific principle to try to predict what planets might be able to sustain life, that they're in this Goldilocks zone.
So it'll work. and not just work, but be ideal so that things can thrive.
What happened to her? Did they just come back and eat her? What? I forget.
No, I think she ran. Probably in the early episodes, she probably got gobbled up. I don't know for sure.
So she eats the porridge and then sleeps in the bed. Was there something else she did?
Tries the chairs first.
Because it's usually you got to do, everything works in threes, right? Yeah.
Yes. And that's kind of, again, we've talked about the magic of three, where two opposing viewpoints cancel each other. A third viewpoint usually brings it around where both of the opposing sizes contribute their valid points, and then the third kind of adjudicates it, synthesizes it, and then it's released as something that's tremendously workable. And it's the same in life. You try something the first time and you fail. Miserably, you fail. You try it the second time, and based on the mistakes you make those kinds of adjustments, and you come up with something that's workable.
And then third time's a charm.
Third time's a charm. And there's so many things, now that I'm really deeply in this folklore and proverbs and that.
Why? So she broke in their house.
Yeah.
What's her backstory? And also, why are there bears living in like a human's house?
Well, here's what I think the distilled understanding that we need to come away with that is, number one, Goldilocks was unsupervised. And for a little girl to be wandering alone in the woods is unthinkable. It's still unthinkable.
Maybe she was a waif. I don't know. What's the line between classic children's story and folklore?
Ooh.
In folklore, you can retell stories that have been handed down to you in your own voice. And the beauty of folklore is each storyteller brings his own current life experience to it. Yesterday, when we retold the little story of Tom and the leprechaun, I use language that's familiar to you, to me. Listen to this.
There's a ship docking. A cruise ship is
It's either
docking.
that or the train. It's either that or right outside our window.
I thought it was fans. I thought it
think
was
it
the
was,
darn paparazzi.
Tell us more about Goldilocks.
The original idea with the show actually was to be a little bit different, and
have
instead
a
of
nice
a quiet
peaceful
studio
breakfast.
and have sounds around you as part of it, which is more like real life. You're sitting at the breakfast table and whatever. You don't
In
care.
the
You're talking
restaurant on
anyway,
Main
right?
Street, you're
But
gonna
I
hear
think
honks.
it's been especially noisy out there from time to time. So maybe it will.
True fans of fairy tales.
Oh,
I think
wow.
it might drive us into the studio after all at some point. So maybe very soon.
It's the paparazzi, darling.
So what would be some kind of folklore about the honking of horns on the street? Is there some? Because you're very knowledgeable in all the proverbs and. So that's a good question though about like the difference between folklore, fairy tales, and proverbs. Does folklore, is that more along the lines of like true events and history? Does it kind of hint at those things being actual, and fairy tales are more of lessons and proverbs, or how does that break down?
Well,
I always thought it was just a matter of age. Folklore would be something that comes down from ancient history sometimes versus just a classic story that was written by somebody in the modern era.
That's what I kind of meant, was like folklore is basically something that's passed down, right? But a fairy tale is something that somebody invents from their imagination.
it can be, but it's a picturesque way of conveying important knowledge to humanity. If you're teaching little children and you want them to remember something, you can say 1,000,000 times, please don't walk through the puddles on your way home from school. I can say that 1,000,000 times. Please don't walk through the puddles, and they're going to do it because it looks like something fun. The child's spirit is to experience things, is for adventure, it's curious, and they're going to test the limits on everything. And so, obviously, do I think my kid is going to drown in the puddle? Probably not, unless there's other factors that I don't understand. But I'll tell you something, a good pair of sneakers that are completely saturated and soggy are going to take a little while to dry out, and they might never be the same. And if it's a special pair of shoes that went through the blah, blah, blah.
That's an odd saying.
blah, blah, blah. Well, the thing is if you teach a child not to stray from the path, which is really the story of Red Riding Hood, don't stray from the path, and be wary of strangers, because when she gets chatting up with the wolf, she's in danger. She's put herself in a vulnerable position because the wolf is a denizen of that forest. And it becomes symbolic. This is a way of conveying important information, not just to a little girl, but really to anybody. If you're in an environment that you are new to, for one thing, and you don't understand all the inner workings and the hidden mechanisms that are at play in that place, then it's best for you to be wary.
Is Red Riding Hood, that's a fairy tale, right? Is that considered a fairy tale? That we were talking about, we mentioned it. We didn't really talk about it too, extensively. But Grimm's fairy tales, stuff like that, about how dark they were.
Oh, extremely dark. And in ages past, children were gobbled up.
Well, Red Riding Hood is a good example of that. You know how that ended originally, right? Is that right?
Yeah. And they didn't safeguard the childish sensibility from the natural consequence.
What was it that the wolf eats the grandmother and wears her skin in the bed? That's what I...
Yeah, in the original story, yes. Then it morphed into he wore her nightdress and her nightcap. If you've seen the old Mother Goose stories, they always have those mop cap on, So, and nowadays, if you look at fantasy movies, things like that, it's very sexy. Red Riding Hood isn't a little girl. She's not a plump, rosy-cheeked little girl. She's a young woman, very voluptuous, and so that's got a whole new appeal for these stories. So they haven't left us. They've morphed considerably.
We see that. We need to know where to find that.
Are you sure you're on the right sites? Where are you seeing this stuff?
Where I see it in the course of this study. Really? Just look up Red Riding Hood.
Why do you think they do that?
Why do you think they do that?
I don't know. It's kind of creepy, though.
It is
That's
creepy.
creepier than wearing your grandmother's skin.
It's very creepy.
There was something else, though, about that. I was trying to think of... there's like a woodsman that comes and chops up the wolf or something.
Yeah, he chops up the wolf. In other stories, the woodsman comes and they tie up the wolf and they carry him away. And then it's never really spelled out what the consequence for the wolf is for being a wolf.
I had such a great, really brilliant thought. And then you mentioned how Red Riding Hood is all adult now. And I'm like, wait, what was my other thought? I can't remember.
It just goes to show a good story or a good image chases away a lot of other things. And so these are ways of teaching people, of capturing the imagination. For people with a religious bent, when Jesus gave his parables, he was speaking to the people in a way he knew they would understand. They were picture stories, and they stay in your head.
Is that the kind of thing with Noah's Ark, where people are trying to prove it's real, and it's it's more of a story with a lesson. It's not like history. Is there
as far as we know, if you ever watch those ancient alien shows and things like that, there is speculation that Noah's Ark, with 2 of every creature on the face of the earth, could be a picturesque way of describing a DNA data bank, so that you wouldn't have the raccoons on there and the crows and all of this, but you would have DNA.
And the billions of insects.
That would be such a pleasant place to be, wouldn't it? Floating around in an untamed sea. But a data bank, that would certainly be as far as we understand, beyond the capabilities of Noah in his time. But today, it is a possibility.
Now, a
Well,
lot
there's
of
some ancient folklore for you. Is all the flood
I was gonna
tales,
say that.
all through the decades,
All
the
different-
millennia, really.
all different cultures and everything. They all have a flood story, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Which brings me to the point. There's a book called Hamlet's Mill. And Hamlet's Mill goes back and visits a lot of the mythology of nations from all over the world, cultures from all over the world. And basically, the premise of the book is that there is scientific, celestial information about how the constellations move, about certain phenomenon that are observable from the point of view of many different observers who transmit that information in story form. When you think about our concept of the constellations, this sort of ties up yesterday's episode where we were telling a fun little folk tale to our last Friday's episode about the moon. And by putting it in those picturesque terms, you can teach it to another generation. And if you use your imagination a little bit and connect the dots with stars in the sky, so you can begin to, with a whole lot of filling in your own mind, you can imagine that Virgo is a woman. You can imagine that Pisces are fish. You can imagine Orion's belt as a belt and not just a string of stars. And because this would be used in ancient navigation, this would be used in all kinds of calculations. And I mean, when we talked about some of the Mayan sites and how precisely they're able to gauge where the sun is going to hit to create a shadow, I mean, we have to give this a lot of credence. And Hamlet's Mill is a fascinating read. It's a pretty fat book. And I admit, I read chapters sometimes 2 or 3 times so that I understand, is this saying what I'm saying, and do I get the gist of it?
It's pretty hard to get through. I've tried a few times, and it's not an easy book to read for sure. But I still am a little confused about, are they trying to say that there is even deeper coded information in these stories from prehistoric times?
Yes. Yes. And so,
Wait, what?
yes, that this...
What is it? Coded messages in the folklore?
And in folklore. And so it isn't just about ways of conducting your behavior to give yourself the best chance of success, which again, you're transmitting the DNA of your family line. So the better your offspring does, the better you do in sustaining yourself and conducting proper relations with your society, the better your family line does.
Does Hamlet's Mill have any it must have examples of that, right? In the folklore, the messages or anything?
The book is full of it. The book is absolutely fascinating. It's about 2 inches thick. And it's an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth.
Who's the author?
This book is by Giorgio de Santillana and Ertha von Dachend.
I've never heard that before, that theory about that. That's fascinating.
And then, you know what they do, too?
Isn't that the 2 guys from Ancient Aliens?
No, that's not the same Giorgio.
Donnegan and Giorgio?
No, not Donnegan,
Is
it's
that the guy with the big
Dachend. The last names, Santillana and Dechend. And the book has a lot of pictures. I have my copy here because I wanted
Hold
to
up to
tell
the
you.
microphone.
Too bad there's not video,
Good
guys.
to do, yeah. No, of course, I was just teasing, but this is predates that show by a lot.
And the stories in it are amazing. And I mean, some of them, they're dense. They're really dense. And I will say, too dense unless you have the time, unless you're really going to devote yourself to something like this and just stay so focused on it so that you can absorb it and retain it.
Oh.
I can read it and the gist of it kind of gets in there, but for me to recite that is beyond my capabilities, and I'll admit it.
If you don't remember specific examples, can you can you give kind of like an example of how what their thoughts, how their theory might work, like coding folklore? Like,
It's
nothing, you don't have to do specific. I'm just curious.
It's in order to for instance, describe procession. You know, the path of the sun. They have very picturesque stories. Some of them involve dung beetles and all of these other things that they've culled from culture. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I know what a dung beetle is. And they basically a dung beetle will lay its eggs in feces. And then they take and they roll that feces across sand. And it creates this hard shell around it. And they're able, the lore suggests that rolling process of moving that round spherical ball of dung across the ground, they correlate that, these cultures correlate that to the path of the sun in the sky. Now, it's something everybody in certainly arid climates, they know. They know what a dung beetle is. They know how it operates. And then if they say, okay, I'm not quite as sure about celestial things, I certainly know that I can look forward to the sun in the morning, or I pray that it comes back in the morning. And so these little correlations from something that's microcosmically apparent to you, when you correlate that to something that's beyond you, that's beyond your ability to touch it or understand it in a big way, all of a sudden it makes it apparent. It's like the stories that we have referring back to yesterday of St. Patrick teaching the concept of a triune Godhead using a little shamrock, you know?
St. Patrick, like rolling around in the sand. I don't remember that.
No.
But
No, but with the little shamrock, he made a spiritual concept. He made it apparent with the three-leafed clover, not a four-leaf. We think four-leaf because the leprechauns and good luck and the luck of the Irish that you mentioned yesterday. But these are picturesque ways of conveying knowledge.
Let me
That's
ask you,
hard.
so, why?
Why do it? Oh, it's a good question. If you in advertising, for instance, how many times does your commercial have to run? Does your message have to run in front of someone's eyes before they understand who your company is and what the product is you're selling and where they can go and get it? Those three things you want to convey at the very least. Lots more information, but those three basic things. And there's absolutely data. How many times that has to pass in front of a person's eyes before the message sinks in. And when you tell a child a story, especially a story with a moral or that is conveying important information about how to conduct yourself, how to be safe, how to be productive, how to continue trying in the face of difficulties, how to arise over challenges, when you tell those stories, and you might tell them in different ways, but the core message is the same. We're laughing about 3 tries. Usually we throw 2 hurdles in front of our hero, and he's always an underdog. It's always the youngest child, because in those societies, they weren't privileged. They were not going to, in European societies, most of them, they would not inherit the family's wealth. And if you're a female, then, you know, the more you could expect to inherit, then the more attractive you would be to a husband who had good means. And the younger ones, there was less left for them. And so a lot of them would take up the cloth. The girls would become nuns. The males might become some kind of a cleric or a monk or a priest or something, because the family wealth was kept intact, because that was the power base of the family. And once you start whacking it up, if you own a camp on a lake and you've got 6 kids and they all get a share of that, there's going to be a lot of problems with the kids. But if it goes with one, to the caveat, or 2 of them, that with the caveat that it's available to everybody, and you establish what the schedule is going to look like, then you can expect that the wealth, what you hand down to your kids, is going to stay intact. But these stories, what the core purpose of these stories is to convey important information about how you conduct your business.
And did they also use them to kind of code message, to code ideas
Yes, it's
and beliefs from getting in trouble with the church or something like that?
Well,
they ever do that?
It's so much of learning has to do with how not to do things. And if you show that someone's behavior, giants or monsters, they're harming people willy-nilly. They're indiscriminate, they're random in their cruelty toward others. Those giants, there's a sensibility in the underdog that we need to take that giant down. And it makes you much, much more vulnerable as an individual if you conduct your business in a way that harms others, in a way that isn't respectful of others. And so these stories are teaching you to overcome hurdles one by one and do it in a sensible way. Most of the time, the hero of the story, and certainly Joseph Campbell's work, talks about the hero of the story, and it's usually not who you would think it is. It isn't usually the guy with the biggest muscles. It isn't usually the guy with the biggest army. It's usually the guy that comes from a humble origin, and he uses his initiative, his smarts, his diligence. Or her. I know recently, and I don't remember the author, there's one, The Heroine, about the heroine. Mm-hmm. And I think there's lessons to be learned in that, and they're just as valid, maybe even more necessary in these times because it feels like things are very out of control.
Well, a good example of that with the Joseph Campbell being an inspiration, and I think was George Lucas in Star Wars. Like Luke Skywalker was some nobody. Well, he turned out to be somebody, but
and that's
in the original
often the case.
In the original story, he was just some
poor little
goofy kid.
Like a foster child.
Yeah, he was really kind
of a foster child.
Whatever.
The genius, wit, and spirit of a nation are discovered in its proverbs. Francis Bacon said that way back when. And so yesterday when we were talking about the Irish
who wrote
country,
Shakespeare.
so a lot of people say, don't they? And we mentioned Oak Island previously too, and there is some thought that perhaps some of Shakespeare's works are hidden there, or the Treasure of Solomon, or all kinds of things, the Ark of the Covenant even. And so their quest there is completely fascinating. It's gone on a lot of seasons. It's cost millions of dollars, but it's worth it.
It'd be great if everything was there.
Just one. We're done. We're done, folks. We're done,
A copy
humanity.
of Shakespeare's play would be plays, the original copies would be great. But I can't imagine these guys after a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars, they trying to hide the disappointment, like, oh, that's great.
No, I admire their stick-to-itiveness and their grit. I know grit's a big thing these days, a catchphrase. I admire it, and I admire their methodology. I know that when you see somebody just kind of tearing things apart, it scares you. I mean, certainly that's the big criticism right now. People who voted for change in Washington, I don't think were quite ready for change conducted in haste.
That's a good point. I mean, what would you say about the relevance, especially even ancient folklore, on today's world?
Well, I will say that, again, the thing I hear most is that I want change, but I don't want it that fast. There's an old German proverb, and proverbs are simply folklore and the gist of folklore condensed into a catchphrase for all intents and purposes. That nothing in haste but the catching of fleas. Nothing in haste but the catching of fleas. And there's a bunch of other ones too. Make haste slowly. And let me think.
So go at normal speed.
The more
pretty much.
haste, the worse speed. That's a good one. The more haste, the worst speed. Meaning that the faster you do things, the more likely you're going to make mistakes. Things are going to have to be undone. Things are going to have to be repaired or reinstated. And your reputation will suffer for having made the mistakes, for not having anticipated unknowables. And so if you really want to progress quickly, then establish a plan for how to do that, a reasonable plan. Understand what you're trying to do. Understand it, not just, hey, we want change and we want it today. A good example in my personal life, when I was young and I was first learning to sew, and you've heard me mention this before about learning to sew. My mom let me make a mistake, and it was the most valuable lesson I've had in the sewing realm. Another valuable lesson I learned, when you put in a zipper, have you ever thought about the process of installing a zipper in a piece of clothing?
Never.
Des, have you ever thought about
I thought about it last night.
Oh, how your dreams are premonitions? We'll have to make another show
I'm
on
hoping
that
it
one.
was a dream. I don't want to know anymore. Thank you anyway. But when you put in a zipper, when I learned in home ec, they said that you should take a needle and thread and you should first baste it in there. Baste means sew it in by hand. So baste it in. The stitches don't have to be pretty. They just have to anchor it in there so the zipper isn't going to be sliding around when you use the sewing machine to install it. And when I did it in home ec so that I could pass the class. But anything that I was making on my own, I didn't bother to baste it in because I figured, well, that's an old-fashioned way of doing it, and it takes extra time. Well, I learned. It didn't take me many tries to put in a zipper on my own, especially in my early going, that you know what? Just take 5 or 10 minutes, sit down, sew the zipper in place, because then you don't have to use straight pins to hold it while you sew. Because every time the sewing machine, the little presser foot, they call it, that's the part that touches the fabric, when that rolls over those pins, it can get stuck. And if you don't have that just right, the combination of the straight pins, the teeth of the zipper, and because to put it in most zippers correctly, there's a piece of extra fabric on one side that folds over the top of the zipper. So you don't see the teeth of the zipper, and it protects it from dirt getting in there, fuzzies and stuff. Anyway, I didn't do it. And so the zipper was put in wrong. And then there would be me sitting there with what they call a seam ripper, which is this little sharp tool. And you pick out the stitches one by one.
So you learned your lesson.
I learned my lesson. Haste makes waste. And there were some of them that I still didn't do right.
And that's stitch and
Time saves 9.
What's that mean?
It means if you take care of a problem when you first see it develop, 1 or 2 little stitches, you're going to prevent a big problem. Like that hat. I told you I'd fix that hat of yours, and I should have when you showed it to me.
The old tale of the person who drank so much they fell asleep on the couch and woke up having to go to the bathroom, but their zipper was broken.
I don't mean to embarrass you, but you wrote a folklore-style story about a big mistake that you made.
And you want me to tell the story? All right, I will tell the story. We were at a little cottage that we owned. And we hadn't been there in a long time. Life had taken us in different directions, and we just couldn't carve out the time to go to visit this little cottage. Well, when we went there was a grapevine growing across the door, a very thick grapevine. And so I went and I got a sharp tool, and I just hacked that vine right off. And we could swing the door open. Actually, it was you, but I directed you, so I'll take responsibility. He cut it off. So actually, it was you.
It was her fault.
It was my fault. Anyway, I said, come on, I need to get in there. Looked like there was going to be rain. I wanted to get all the windows open. I want to get the place aired out. Lots of big reasons why that needed to happen. Anyway, next day, we come out. The cottage is completely picturesque, and this grapevine covered the whole front of the cottage. But by cutting that stalk that stem, that vine, from away from the door, the whole right side facing the building, the whole right side of the vine was dead, irreparably gone. So now we have this beautiful vine on one side of the fascia of the cottage and nothing on the other. After we pulled all of that away, it was so barren and so unbalanced, and it just looked pitiful. And I felt so ashamed of myself for not understanding that I was dealing with a living thing. That wasn't garbage that you pick up and throw in a bin and it's gone and it makes you feel good, that you've tamed it and it's not in your world anymore. That was a living thing. And there was, I realized later, a little hook above the door that if I had taken even 5 minutes to evaluate what I was doing, what the plan was here, if I had taken a second, I'd have noticed the hook and understood that I could just take a little piece of string, tie that up above the door could then swing freely open, and problem would be solved. The pretty vine would be intact on the other side of the wall. And for the rest of that time, in time it grew back. But it took a long time. And for the rest of that summer, every time we visited, it was so glaring to me that I was rash in wielding the knife.
But it revealed a hidden sundial on the side of the building.
Yes, it did. Underneath that vine was a sundial, but there's a problem with the sundial, and I don't know if you... Once I say this, I can never unsay it.
Does it work at night?
No. It's a worse problem, and maybe it's just a psychological thing, but I'm going to ruin that sundial for you if I tell you the story. Do you want me to tell you?
No.
Do you?
No.
Okay.
Wait, is it part of
I need some time.
Is it part of the,
No, I'm going to tell
I'm
you
not
anyway.
quite ready yet.
No, I'm going to tell you anyway.
Wait, is it part of the story you wrote?
No.
Okay.
No, when the story I wrote, I left
It's
the
based-
sundial very romantic, but I'll tell the real story.
Oh, no, you have to leave it a mystery.
But it's killing me, I want to tell you.
You'll survive, I'm sure.
So maybe what's unsaid is better than what is said.
But what you just described, that you also wrote a story based on that?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
So what if you boiled that down to a parable or a one-liner, what might that be?
Good gardeners make good kings.
Oh, yeah, I remember that line. Or give the vine some time, I don't know.
Nope, good gardeners make good kings. Because wielding the blade is never a first option, or should never be a first option.
It's good.
That's good. It's good. And I think it's true because you are dealing with living things. When you are dealing with people, when you're dealing with the raising of children, when you're dealing with helping people overcome the obstacles of their own life, it's important to understand that you don't take the ultimate solution to eradicate the problem because everything is interconnected. And when you go through the folklore, you go through the proverbs of cultures all over the world, and you find there's so much overlap. Now, with the study of the proverbs, for instance, and I just mentioned some about haste makes waste, haste makes speed worse, all of these things. Those are from everywhere. They're from France, they're from Germany, some of them are Latin. There's many African proverbs that people, they use in general. They become cliches, and they're considered cliches and dismissed. Usually, if you're writing something, a publisher tries to steer you away from those things. But that's the understanding of that culture that's distilled into a phrase.
Is a parable also, where does that lie in the whole thing?
A parable is usually considered a picturesque way, a graphic way, of conveying spiritual information that you would have to speak of in esoteric terms. So the vine and the branches, I am the vine, you are the branches.
So-
From a Christian perspective,
So-
we understand, like my story.
Could you consider a metaphor as a form of parable?
Yes, I would say so. And if you remember, back when you were learning English composition, your teacher encouraged you to write with similes and metaphors because your writing becomes more memorable. It's more, if you can correlate it to something that's personal to you, to your unique viewpoint, which comes kind of back around to respecting each individual, because we each bring a perspective based on our life experience to whatever it is. One of the things that I hope for with this podcast is by looking at current events, looking at what's going around in each of our everyday lives, in our common one under a political system, in our common experience, maybe from a shared religious perspective or from the understanding of someone else's religious perspective, then I'm hoping that we can pull all of that together by turning down the heat on things. And let's try to take a step back, zoom out. Let's talk about things in more long-term perspectives. A perspective that taps into the essential information that has been passed down to us through these stories, through the Proverbs, through just the kinds of things our grandparents told us about. I'm just going to throw this out there. My grandmother used to talk about World War I and how scary it was. And she said that when the call-up came for the young men to sign up for the military, she says a lot of them went with every intention of being able to fight, to join. But they were turned away because they were in very poor health. And they found out that a lot of the health problems that the young people were having were because they had had improper nutrition. And that really is the beginning of the school lunch programs in America. They found that if we can make sure that the children get proper nutrition at least once a day, then they're healthier adults. And at the time, it was very self-serving. We want them so that we can use them for boots on the ground in a military conflict. But if you think about it, if they're not relying on government health care systems or anything like that because their health is generally better, then it's a good program.
Well, isn't having food to eat a form of health care?
It is proper food to eat, and that would mean that maybe Michelle Obama had it right. Let's look at the school lunch program and let's make sure that the food that they are eating there isn't, potato chips in a bag.
And to your, you were talking about the World War I experience and stuff. Do you think like folklore and parables and all that stuff is a form of, like you're saying, kind of sugarcoating history so we don't repeat it?
Absolutely. And if you think about it, Hollywood does that. The movies do that. All the literature, the stories. That's why, since that has been taken out of the school systems for the most part, they don't read novels for the most part. And now there's a certain empathy that's lost and a certain historical perspective that's lost because it's hard for a student today to be able to identify with, people of their grandparents' era. And stories, novels, parables, myth, legend, proverbs, all are ways of carrying that information forward.
Storytelling and history. So we can learn from the
Yes.
world and the universe and each other.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I guess we're at the end of another podcast. And I always worry ahead of time, oh my gosh, 45 minutes is such a long time. And do we have enough to talk about? And I'm always shocked how quickly it goes by.
This is another subject where I think we will probably revisit once in a while. It is fascinating, and there's a lot more to tell.
There is a lot more to tell. And after I get further down into my project, maybe I'll be able to talk more freely about what it is and it's kind of a fun thing, and I'm looking forward to having it be closer to completed, but it's coming along. I hope everybody's day is really good. Take a second or two to count the blessings around you and to think maybe on some of the stuff that your grandparents said. And with that, I'll say goodbye for today. Have a wonderful time.
Okay, see you next time, everybody.